do this one? So thank you for coming back, staying with us. We're going to move to Rethinking Relationships, the Future Art Institution, the first part of the relay. So we invited a number of artists, scholars, activists who in one way or another have been engaged with BAK or the Basic Activist Kitchen, or as fellows or as artist practitioners in the project. And this first session will be moderated by Mustapha Seray Bah, who's a trainer, organizer, educator, and also director of Stichting Mowat, Foundation Mowat. And to get it right, Mustapha, I'm going to read his Migrant Organization for West African Development. And I'm really happy you're here again, and the floor is for now yours. Thanks, Mustapha.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. How are you guys feeling? Good? Are you guys in the mood? Can I ask you one favor? Can you please change seats, except for the people in front? The people at the back? Can you just sit to someone else? Can you just take another seat, please? You're not moving, eh? Ah. Okay, thank you very much. Can you come back? No, sorry. Thanks for being here. Please feel free to interrupt. Feel free to ask questions. Feel free to participate. The questions that I'm going to ask to my guest, the questions are also for you. Please feel comfortable in asking whatever question you want, and also to contribute. I'm the host for this session. I would like to welcome two of my guests, one of which is Triwish. Triwish is a cultural and social entrepreneur. Please welcome. Have a seat. And Nicoline, she's a video artist. Shall I say it that way? Is it good? Come on, visual artist. Come on. Welcome. What's your impression of the day so far?
Very good. I'm happy to be here again. I was here a few months ago with the Trappenhuisgesprekken, and I had a lot of conversation, good conversations with the people from this town. And I'm curious about today, actually.
Okay,
yeah.
Nice. And you?
My first impressions?
Yes.
Well, the first half of the two speakers were very impressive and very dense in their speeches, so I hope we are able to follow up on that.
Okay, nice. Let me just go straight to the question. How can we influence, or how can we try to, I don't want to say change, please correct me if I'm wrong, the institution, the way they work, do you have any idea about it? Shall I start with you?
Okay. Luckily, we already spoke a little bit. So because this is a very big open question, and I don't think it is only about BAK, but it's about art institutions, I assume we're talking about. My focus would be on the language that we use in institutions, and in days like today, where we're using the English language, although there's not that many people who would speak that continuously day by day. So we're using a tool, sorry, Jean, of English. And the other thing I also mentioned is the archive, the memory of the institution. And this is something that I would definitely want to keep institutions like this for, or all of them.
Can you please give an example? What kind of memory are we talking about?
But funny, when we just met, you said, I don't know you. And I'm like, well, I don't know you. And you said, but I'm here a lot. And I said, well, I'm here a lot, but we've never met because I was here a lot maybe 3 years ago and you are here a lot this year. And it means that we each have our memories and our experiences in this institution, but the institution itself holds the whole of that. And BAK as an institution goes way back as well. Yeah. And we've grown as makers, as thinkers, as art, all of us, everyone involved over the years. We need places that remember that. And maybe not through a collection of bought items, but in another way. And I think that's a really important task also for an institution.
Okay. And how do you see it?
How do we change these institutions?
Yes.
And that's a good question. I think there's a lot of different processes going on for this. Because on the one side you have the artists themselves who are creating and performing. And I think institutions have their own life, you know, they open, they want expositions. And I think there's the community, and I think we are all here to find out how we can combine these processes together, you know, how does the community find these places, but also how do artists find these places? Because I'm an artist myself, I'm a rap artist, and I was, when I got this question, I was thinking, and I thought, okay, I haven't made music in a long time now, so I'm about to make a new album. And if I'm finished, I'm talking about Utrecht city, because I'm from this city, so for me it's a home game, and I know the situation here. So if I have an album out, I could go to a venue, like the most popular venues in Utrecht, but there's not a lot of them. So that would mean as an artist, I would have 3 shows and I'm finished in my own city. And that's weird, because I'm trying to build a career. I'm trying to perform, and it doesn't always have to be on a stage. It could be at a place like this, with a song about a subject that's connected to the exhibition. Yeah.
Okay. Does anybody have any comment or additional thing that you might like to say about exhibition and language? Does everybody here speaks English? Is there anybody that doesn't speak English? So the common language is quite good.
Yeah, but the common language is not just English, it's a certain type of English. It's not just one language.
Yeah? Is that true? Can I have another microphone? Yeah, on that side.
I'm just agreeing. That's what a snap is. But it's nice to...
You disagree?
No, agree. I'm just snapping. I'm agreeing. It's a yes. I agree with this. We're clearly speaking a form of English that is a skill that requires knowledge and... Sorry, my apologies. I don't mean to make you hold it. That require... I think I'm assuming what you would say. It's a kind of English. Not everyone who speaks English would understand this. Many people don't, and some people probably in this room have trouble. I'm having trouble sometimes.
What kind of English or what kind of language can we suggest then? Does anybody have any idea?
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Yeah, just for myself, I don't have problems with English itself as a language, but and one idea is to when the language becomes very abstract and continuously abstract, I have trouble following. So for me, to jump back into concrete situations and scenarios is a way for me, and I think a lot of people, to be more engaged and follow better.
Okay. What kind of platform can we create then in terms of language?
Can I just add something to that?
Yeah,
Because
sure,
it's
sure.
not just about a problem and a solution, I guess. I would say that it's very typical that we're talking about language in this institution, or language attached to forms of visual art production or other cultural production. Because it's really hard to imagine visual art, let's say, without language anymore. I mean, images are always contextualized through words, whether written or spoken. Exhibitions are done through words. This exhibition, we're surrounded by words, relies heavily on words. So you can't just say we should change the language, therefore change the situation, because that's a mistake that, you know, a lot of people have made for really bad reasons as well. So, but you can think of the language that we use, the English that we use here, as some kind of intellectual style. It's a style, like a lot of things that you see in a museum or in an institution are, you know, they're aesthetics that can be read, that can be understood, that you can train to understand and compare, and that's what the language is that we speak. So if you want to do something else in the institution, then you might think more about the aesthetic of that language and how it's learned and who learns it and so on.
Okay.
Yeah, that's something that I think a lot about. I used to be the director of the Queen's Museum, which is a place that is surrounded by neighborhoods of immigrants from where many immigrants live from totally different parts of the world. 165 languages are spoken in the borough of Queens, which is part of New York City. And you know, I struggled with this question about literal language, like should we translate things? And then after spending some time in the museum, I realized that this this thing about what register the language is in, whichever language you choose, is actually, in some senses, far more important, because if you translate a curatorial language into Spanish, it's still curatorial language in Spanish or Mandarin or Bangla or whatever. And so one of the ideas that I thought was kind of interesting to experiment with is to kind of imagine different registers being able to exist side by side in the artistic space.
What do you mean by register?
So different types of interactions, and you know, because even as if you try to write a curatorial text, even in the most direct language, which is something we always really strove for, to kind of avoid rhetoric and kind of words that were very arty, let's just say, it still belonged to this kind of larger discourse and needed to a certain degree, for the artists, for the people who care about that stuff. But also for many people who came to the museum who were not coming because they have a profound love for contemporary art. It was just their neighborhood museum, and so they wanted to come and check things out. So, you know, what if you had other people who were experts of a different kind, experts who were not like art experts per se, but were experts at the neighborhood or experts at what the museum was about, and they picked an artwork to discuss, right?
Yeah, exactly. Is that? Does somebody else have any other idea? What does language play in your music and in terms of portraying it to the audience, or in terms of the institutional wise?
For me, language is very important because, I'm a lyricist. I make rap music, and I don't make the rap music you see today on TV. So that's why it's probably more difficult for me to get into the mainstream. But I think language is very important. I mean, if you take rap music, I don't know how many people of you listen to rap music, but...
Who doesn't listen to rap music? Who doesn't listen to rap music?
At home?
5 people.
that's a lot.
That's a lot, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the rest does listen to rap music.
So drop a beat. No, I think you can, if you take rap, you can see what it has done from history till now. When it started, I don't know if you know the history of hip hop. Most people probably got Netflix and now already know all. But hip hop started in the Bronx, and it started because the people were not able to get the new music systems and the new instruments to get to make the music. So people literally started booming and bamming with their hands, and others started singing and talking with their mouths,
So there was no connection from the people and the institution and the mainstream
No,
organization.
definitely not.
So they have to create their own.
No, hip hop is actually originated because people had nothing and they wanted to tell the story. So I think that's how important for me the message is also, the word, you know, the worth of the word. And I think you can reach a lot of people. I mean, if you see hip hop, there's 15 years old going ape on heavy trap beats, but there's also all the generation that listens to hip hop with meaning, with community subjects. And for me, that still is the essence of hip hop, and as a power, as a music.
Okay. Considering the fact that we are here, institutional, otherwise in the not yet, is there a kind of a way that we can rethink the way we portray language and try to portray it together in institutions, that it is continually analyzing the language that we use, so that we can, I don't want to say integrate again, but the whole, everybody that has to do with the institution feel at least with the communication, because that is what these trainings and this project is about. Mm-hmm. Is there a way? Does everybody have any idea how we're gonna? What do you think about it? Yeah.
There are lots of things that can be done, I guess. But it depends. It's also important how people think of their own language. As often people think of their own language as faulty or not complete or broken. The number of times I hear the word broken English, I can't stand it, because English is not a language that belongs to a community of speakers from a certain place. It belongs to everyone who was trained to speak this language, or who was forced to learn these languages to get by. So we need to we need to think of our own English as not a faulty English, but one that can be used also actually as a medium. As I don't know what language do you use for rapping.
I rap in Dutch now, but I'm also working on my English and my Hindi.
Okay. But Hindi is also like one of the big five, right?
Yes.
So
five,
yeah. But I would say that actually I made a course called the English is MOOC, Massive Online Open Course, which is something that big universities produce to kind of gain more students abroad, and they're usually in English. But the English is MOOC actually helps people to young makers, I call them. Usually it's art students who sign up and work on it. And I train them in 6 weeks online.
6 weeks?
6 weeks online to, first of all, learn about the history of English as it exists, to learn phonetic alphabet so they can analyze the sounds they make, the intonation they use. They learn about constructed language, self-constructing language, and so on. So I'm actually putting my ideas to use and my studies in that sense. So that's one for people who are now in art schools or young makers to kind of also use this and be aware of that. Okay,
nice. Thank you very much. There's a small interchange. We use a kind of format in this discussion. Welcome, Shay. You are a designer and a project initiator. Welcome to this discussion. You're going to come back to the stage.
Yes,
thank you so much for your contribution
Thank you.
now. I always think time limit is always a thing for me. I don't want to see any clock, actually, because I don't like time limitation. But welcome.
Thanks.
What is your impression so far on the conversation that you just heard?
I was hoping there would be a rap moment.
maybe later.
I'm happy that the day started with the 2 conversations, because that helped me to get things a bit more clear in my mind on a Saturday. So thank you for that. I've been thinking a lot about the understanding of a threshold. So I work as an initiator of the Voorkamer, a meeting space here in Utrecht, where we try to connect migrants, people from all over who are not necessarily home at Utrecht or do not feel at home at Utrecht, with the local community. So we do work with using terms and inclusivity and participation, and these are for me not loaded terms. So I think I'm really happy that I graduated in the last couple of years, and not 20 years ago, where the role of a designer is not to make a melting chair that sells or a beautiful banana lamp, but that I have an opportunity as a designer to work with terms as participation and diversity. So that's me being maybe opportunistic, but I'm really happy that now this is one of the ticking boxes maybe of museums and cultural institutes, because that gives us, I think, great chance to create within that kind of setting. And I think when we think about a threshold, so what makes it for people easy to enter and participate and join, and what makes it difficult for them to join. So what is the threshold that we are creating or designing to allow for people to feel a sense of belonging in our space, or a sense of safety, a safe space? And language could be one of these thresholds, something that makes you feel unsafe or not at ease, or you're afraid to make a mistake. But it's not only the language. And I don't think there should be one understanding of a threshold of, okay, we should make it so easy for everyone in terms of maybe where we work with music, that if we do a jam session, then everyone can participate, rather than only showing very, very skilled musicians, because then you feel like you can't contribute. It's about a variety of different interventions and activities. Some of them could be very conceptual, and therefore appealing to certain audience with certain interests, and some of them could be maybe without words, based on food.
I've been to the Voorkamer.
Yeah.
I've been there several times. The dynamic of language, actually, it is universal.
Yeah.
Because if you're there, you are not obliged to speak one particular language. You feel like welcome. Because there are people from different cultural background. There are different cultural dynamics.
Yeah.
Because if you're there, you feel like, okay, I don't necessarily have to speak Dutch or Arabic. So it is a kind of a behavior. Is it?
It's a behavior.
Is it? Did I understand it?
Yeah, I
properly?
think it's really a question of what makes you feel at home. Like, what makes a space feel a welcoming space? Why is it that you enter a certain space and you feel directly like, I can be myself, it's safe here? Or a place where you enter and you want to disappear in the shadows. And I think it's different things related to design, but also related to the people that participate and make that space happen. So for me, it's two things. One would be the design of the space, the physical conditions. Scale, it's a small space. I saw somewhere, kleinschalig. I think that's really important, actually. It's maybe very obvious, but when a space is smaller, then you feel like you're in a living room.
How can we integrate that into institution? Is there any idea that we can, this kind of, I think it's an energy, eh?
It's an energy, yeah.
Do we have any idea how we can transform that, or at least influence that in institution or in our sector? Does anybody have any idea?
I have an idea.
Go ahead.
Well, I don't know if it's accepted, but if I sometimes say the museum visitor experience for me is not, and I'm talking about Stedelijk or Rijksmuseum and the bigger institutions, it's not dissimilar. And although I go quite often to the experience I have in the Albert Heijn or in a supermarket, that surveillance and that, you know, are you sure you're here in the right place, and move along? But just the surveillance and the you know, what they're supposed to have internalized in terms of who they're going to make uncomfortable, and that you can't really name that because it's so fleeting. And yeah, I would wish that would be looked into, and I'm also researching that, just the museum visitor experience and that aspect of this theatrical surveillance on other people that you're not expecting to be there. And it's, I mean, the Concertgebouw, there's just institutions where you just already know and you feel, and then you're also treated as if you're not, I would work on that.
Okay. Anybody else?
Hi. Most of the time, interactions and the discourse happens in the art space or in places designated for the conversations like this. Mm-hmm. But now we're experimenting, like bringing art into the kitchen. We have the basic activist kitchen, and we're experimenting in bringing the kitchen out into the art space. And there's a lot of conversations, political and about art and culture as well, happening inside the kitchen while we prepare food. And it extends into the dining experience as we share the communal meal. And I think we should really explore these kinds of explorations into the space and activities.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Anybody else want to contribute? Is it a challenge? Is it a challenge to make institutions realize this? Because this is something you cannot actually touch. Eh?
I think I'm also hearing a difference, because to me this place feels like a professional space. Maybe because of my profession, but I think most of us are here from some kind of professional viewpoint, whereas your space isn't. It's a place where you meet, so it's more in the private realm. So one thing I don't open when I'm entering the door is my private life, things that are happening. And food is kind of course, on the edge there, but still having a dinner in this professional space to me would still feel a bit like work, you know? So I think these are very, I'm sorry, but it does. So, I mean, these are realms that are different, and I don't think you can just compare them and say, oh, we need to act like that. Because my home language is different. And for a lot of people, they use different languages in different realms. So at home, I use a different language. This is a professional realm, so English, or my other professional realm, German. So we kind of, you know, we save certain words and certain languages for certain areas. So you cannot just transport that and say, oh, here you can speak whatever you want, because, you know, it doesn't really work like that.
That's interesting. I think that's linked towards professional-private, because I think I do the voorkamer from a professional perspective, or I feel like it's something I do professionally, because I do it from my skills and background, and I get 4 hours a week paid. But when you counter professional, then you would talk about volunteer work in a way. And we are trying to kind of rethink and challenge how we define volunteer work. Vrijwilliger, something you do from your own will. So on one hand, I think it's really important to have professional attitude in places like the voorkamer, because it brings the level of execution higher, so it makes things sometimes be just more attractive. If there is a graphic designer involved, if something is more beautiful and aesthetic, it brings more people. So in a way, it's not only the people that are super socially engaged that will come, they will come anyway, but you also bring people that maybe on a Friday night wouldn't go to a more socially engaged event, rather go to a concert, but because it looks good, they will come. So in that sense, for me, the professional realm is really important. And then the volunteer side would be, how do we define volunteer work? Is helping one another the only way to do volunteer? Or by participating, by just being there? You said, Jeanne, I think, being with one another, being together. I think that's also volunteering. So for me, the act of participation, or the act of taking part in making someone feel at home or feeling belonging, by playing music or eating together, is volunteer work. And I'm trying to kind of look for a new challenging term for that in the society in general.
Yeah. But is that what we actually need? That incorporation between voluntary work and professional? It's mostly...
No, it's not volunteer and professional, because I feel that's an economic kind of area, whether you're paid for it or not.
What is it then? What is it?
Because, you know, as artists, you don't often do... But it's the home, it's the private and the professional realm. I think that's it's not only the public, because that's the street, that's a different area again. But even, I mean, being a good member of the audience is also work. You know, you go to an event like this, and being an audience member, you have a responsibility. If no one asks a question, you know, try to think of one. So of course we're all in it together. That's why it's not a passive space. And therefore, you know, we use different words and different ways of communication.
Yes. Do anybody have any questions so far? Yeah?
One of the things that I've been thinking about is the word intimacy, and how we draw relational intimacy in spaces that might feel, for some of us, professional, for other of us, places where we spend leisure time, etc. And I think, one of the things that I think the BAK Activist Kitchen has done, for example, is just create a feeling of intimacy around the table, which, while it might not feel like having dinner at home necessarily, hopefully it encourages, or at least creates a space where that kind of relational work can happen. And it doesn't mean that it's always comfortable, but at least it's possible, right? And then one other thing I just wanted to add to the conversation was about the fact that our verbal communication fails so often, no matter what language we're speaking, and that, only...
What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean by that is that, first of all, only something like 95% of what we understand from one another comes from our physical gestures, the way that we move our eyes, our facial expressions, and other things. The rest comes from our words. And so when we think about it that way, it's like, wow, my words really might not mean very much.
I really want to add something there, because we are speaking now, and so we're in this kind of choreography here. So yes, that counts, the way we, the way we look and the way we behave. But again, going into the idea of the archive and the keeping what's being said, this is also being recorded and being written down. Mm-hmm. We have a lot of, you're a keynote speaker today, or you give a speech. I think you've written some things down. So in this setup, the spoken and the written are constantly going back and forth, and the written word is in that sense very different, and does not have the gesture and the meaning. So, and I must say, I mean, the two main lectures today are given by people who are native speakers of the English language, and therefore, the written language will be different than my written English, for example. So I think in those texts you will be able to see the difference. And if there's a book that publishes outcomes of today, for example, it will be edited by someone who fishes out the mistakes. Unless the institution decides not to do that, which is one of the first things I would totally cheer. Let's not have the native English editor for our written archive of this day.
It's very funny what you guys just exchanged, because I'm from a culture where we don't write that much. We tell a lot. And in our art culture, most of our artistic items, what we produce, is in Central Europe right now. I'm a Fulani from West Africa, and we make a lot of arts, but we tell what it is. We don't just make item. If you are from our culture, if you see a certain item, you know what the message of the item is. So we don't have to write a small text on it and what it says. So that is a total other kind of integration. So when I see an abstract, hoe zeg je dat? Abstract kunst? By the university, then you see a big metal thing. Then I try to figure out what is the message behind it. So for the Western culture, you have to enlighten it, you have to explain, you have to write it, you have to give it depth. For us, from my point of view, it's something you have to decode. You have to have the knowledge of it. So that's a very interesting thing. Maybe that is a way to try to integrate that into institutionalization, because the world is getting smaller. I'm sitting down here right now. A few years ago, I was not here. So maybe that's another way of training ourselves. Again, in the institution, there are different ways. Yes, you have something to say?
I just related to what you said, because it's just a very interesting reversal, because normally caption texts are understood to sort of make something accessible, but what you're saying, what I understand, is sort of caption texts obscure, right? So we can talk about the level of accessibility through captioning. But what you're saying is that the center of the knowledge is in the person already, and that we do not need this kind of translation through any particular language. But so sometimes no text can actually recognize the knowledge that is there.
Maybe it's a misunderstanding that there's only one way to understand it. That big circle by the university, you can also just see it.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't need to know the history of what makes that work possible. When you can learn the history of what makes that work possible, but a single tag won't do that work for you either. So it's done its job for you because you looked at it and noticed it. So there's one. I don't know.
Yeah,
if
but
it needs
maybe
more.
that is also a method that we can integrate into, because we have Western items too in most of West African countries. There are people have to also decode it. People have to know what it is. So it is an integrated. Sorry. Welcome, Esajas. Nice that you're here. I'm sorry to this conversation. But you can share with us?
Yeah,
Thank you very much for being here. You can join us back later.
Thank you.
very much. It's okay. No, it's okay. We're trying to do otherwise. I'm trying to do otherwise. I don't want to be the same structure, so I'm trying to do otherwise. So carry on. You wanted to say something?
The reason I wanted to join the conversation was because you're kind of talking about archives, and I'm from the Black Archive, so I have some thoughts about this. And yeah, I wanted to add to what you said, that there are different ways of looking at, how knowledge is produced, how art is produced, what is considered art and knowledge. And I agree that from a quote-unquote Western point of view, written words are considered more powerful or better than other forms of knowledge, in contrast to, for example, in a lot of African countries or even Latin American countries. And within that idea of the archive, there's also often the assumption that archives are neutral and objective, which is something that we beg to differ with. For example, when you look at national archives, archives of art institutions, you can ask the question, who created the archives, when were they created, with which intention, and often you see that a lot of these institutions were created, and their archives were created to, or by the people who were part of the, systems of imperialism, colonialism, etc. So within the archive itself, you already see a structural inequality. So I think it's good to be critical about it.
Thank you very much for that contribution. Those people also recognize what he just said. Yeah? Who doesn't? So everybody recognizes it. What can we do to influence institution about that? Is the big question. How can we do that? Does anybody have any idea? You have an idea?
I have a few.
Yeah? Go ahead.
Also, going back to the first question or the first conversation, something that I was thinking about was that, institutions don't change themselves. I'm very pessimistic about institutions talking a lot about, hey, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. I think people change the world, people change institutions. And there's power in people coming together and, challenging structures of power. And I speak out of the little bit of experience that I have. I used to work at the University of Amsterdam, for example. I've worked with a few art institutions here and there. And what I notice is that also when you study history, most change usually comes from people who organize and mobilize and challenge institutions of power. And here and there, of course, there are some institutions and individuals within institutions, such as BAK. We have a few great people who are doing great work here. But in general, I think most institutions, because of the archives and the memory and the structures.
Are you trying to say they are static?
Very static.
Very static.
Conservative in general.
Okay.
So I think one of the most effective ways to change them is to, criticize them, challenge them from outside, sometimes through art. To give one concrete example, talking about language. is what happened a few months ago with the Amsterdam Museum, or the Hedendaagse Museum, maybe you know it. They used to have this exhibition called Hollanders van de Gouden Eeuw. I think English word title was The Golden Age Portrait, something like that. And that title in itself is, in my opinion, very excluding a lot of people. Golden Age, referring to the 17th century.
Did everybody go to the exhibition? Who saw the exhibition? One person?
You didn't miss
So
much.
the rest didn't see it. Shall I ask why not? Sorry?
She said it's in Amsterdam.
Yeah. Or in
Why would you go there?
Okay, carry on.
Yeah, I'll keep it short. So, Golden Age, 17th century. So, for some people, it's seen as a golden age, apparently. Like our Prime Minister Rutte, he said it's great, the Golden Age. But when you look at the same era from another perspective, you know, it's an era of violence, imperialism. 1667 was when Suriname was colonized. 1652 when Curaçao was colonized. 1637 from the top of my mind, the Cape of Good Hope. So if you ask people from South Africa, Suriname, Curaçao, it was a golden age. I think they will beg to differ. So that is one very concrete example of how language, excludes people and why it should change. And I think institutions should therefore look critically at what kind of language and words they use.
It's also collaborating with institution, an idea of trying to influence change, other than only criticizing them. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I think in relation to the stuff we have been doing with BAK, I think now we're going to organize the third time a very big party here, where we dance to a combination of Shakira, some dabka, and Afghan Iran pop. And of course, it's really strange. Like, why would we organize this kind of party in BAK? I think it's not something that is very obvious. And it started almost as a joke when I was asking the team of BAK, can I do it here? And then it kind of became an activity, a form of interacting with the public, a form of BAK being a base, a hospital institution for this kind of party to take place, because this party it is for women only, so in a way exclusive, but also inclusive, because it allows women that don't have any other place to dance, feeling safe, to come here and dance, and by doing just dancing together, being together otherwise. So I think this is a very simple, very tangible example of how we are collaborating with the institute. I think it's really, I think it would be really cool to do more of these things in more crazy institutes, in the Rijksmuseum, to make it crazy parties like that. Dancing together rather than talking. We do very little talking then.
What also strikes me a lot is that if you are a local citizen, just a regular person, you have an idea that you want to work with an organization such as BAK or the bibliotheek, or the library, I mean then, you have to sometimes perform as an institution. If I want to organize something in one of the neighborhoods here, I really have to have a Kamer voor Koophandel, hoe heet het?
KVK
number. So that is sometimes very strange, if you look at it from a kind of perspective, because I feel that I'm a member of society, I think.
Yeah, it's also the form of being organized and formalizing ourselves. So in the Voorkamer, it started as two young students wanting to do something. Yeah. But in order to do something, we had to have a foundation. Therefore, we had to register. Therefore, we had to be eligible to different conditions.
Was it the same for you too?
We had to. And then, just to finish that thought, now we want to make it a sustainable place, a place that can live longer than if we are tired of it and we want to do something else. And that means we really have to get even more organized and structured. And if we want to be supported by the city, then we become no more a grassroots initiative, but maybe an institute. So how can we stay sustainable and stable, actually, for the future, without falling into organizational, formal bureaucracy traps?
You also have the same, eh?
Actually, we have the same challenge.
Yeah.
We started as a grassroots organization called New Urban Collective, a collective of students from Surinamese, Caribbean, and African backgrounds, because we found that existing institutions, especially educational institutions, were too white and Eurocentric. So we started our own thing. And yeah, throughout time it kind of evolved into what we do now with the Black Archives and also a few other projects. But indeed, I think there's a constant challenge of finding the balance between staying grassroots, which to me means, being able to speak your own truth, being able to, criticize these institutions without being afraid that for repercussions and stuff like that. But at the same time, you have to be pragmatic and realize that you have to pay bills at the end of the month. You have to eat. You have to live. And in this, logistical capitalist world? Yeah.
And this brings
that
me...
means you need money.
Yeah, and this brings me to the sentence that you saw on one of the slides that says, institutions sustains us and also wipes out. This is a classical example of it.
Now, I wanted to maybe add, as far as I understand, an institution is a place or like something that has a purpose, like it has a goal. So I think also for institutions, it could be interesting to think of the fact that if you're really successful, if you achieve your goal, you should not exist anymore. You should be unnecessary if you make it to your goal, which is a very strange thing that if you're very successful, actually it finishes. While I think you also said that all the institutions seem static. So they're not going anymore towards a goal. So also the question becomes, are they still institutions maybe?
Thank you. Anybody else want to contribute to that? People, please feel free. These are the moments. Go ahead.
I just wanted to add to that, institutions that has a goal. By the very definition of instituting, it's a difficult word. It means trying to preserve, to embed something into something, preserving it to be able to be accessed by the future. So I think it has to be kept in mind always, because if we don't, then we might get lost into running this institution for us or for the past. No, it's for the future generations. And those of us who are working in institutions that are aiming to change the existence now, that is very oppressive, and we seek to create a better future and institute new values that would prevent the continuation of what is happening now into the not yet, or what will be. There are threats. Like in BAK, when we have activities, I work here in the kitchen, in the technique, but I also embrace the institution. I take ownership of it. I'm part of it. And during some of our activities, we have to talk about security. There are threats. And I had a friend coming here over. He's from Bolivia. They're setting up a university, a department of art. And what happened in Bolivia recently, there was a coup. And they're threatened. Their very existence is threatened. Physically, they might be killed, they might be arrested. As in what happened in Latin America in the 80s, it's going to happen again. And it's happening in many countries. So we should also include that in our minds. No?
So actually, what you are actually trying to say, the institution that we actually have, and ook the purpose of BAK, of Tivoli, of the museum, they also have to reflect the social and economic dynamics that are facing in society right now, to make sure that it portrays in their how do you say that, in their exhibitions, in their outwards.
Yes, we're talking about the future, you know, creating or maintaining or continuing these institutions for the future, and we should confront these challenges.
Is there something about this?
Thank you.
I think yesterday there was a session as well with Laura. Maybe you will talk about it later on. And there was an interesting discussion about these definitions of the, was it ICON, this International Museum Association? And there's a proposal for a new definition. And one of the parts says that institutions should have a commitment to social justice, something like that, which is something I really like. I think if we talk about rethinking institutions, I think the commitment to social justice should be central, especially with all these urgencies. But that indeed comes with, you know, certain risks. To give one concrete example, besides Black Archives, I'm also part of a group called Kick Out Zwarte Piet. We've heard something about it the past few weeks. We're trying to kick out the blackface tradition out of the Dutch culture. And yeah, we've been faced with a lot of threats, death threats, and literal physical violence as well from fascists and white supremacists. So yeah, the challenge for us, for example, with the Black Archives is that to the public, and I hope, you know,
everybody,
people here are a bit nicer than others, but to, you know, the general public, for us it is a risk to connect the Black Archives to Kick Out Zwarte Piet, because there's a serious risk that some of these white supremacists will come to the archive and start a fire or something like that, because we don't have the resources for security every day, 24/7. So
actually,
yeah.
we need each other. We need collaboration. There is a different kind of mindset that should take place. Yeah? Steffi, I'm going against the rules. I've invited all the guests again because I think inclusion is a good thing. We all should we should share, and I think mobilization of ideas is also very important. Please, if you have any other comments that you want to contribute, please feel free.
Yes, I'm happy to be back. I was thinking about this mentality. I think it's all about mentality. Mentality. It's about the artist having a mentality, but also a thing like the city of Utrecht. In my example, I mean, as an artist, imagine you are an artist and you have new work, whether it's paintings or music, whatever. Do you think of Utrecht as something in your plan for exploring? So if you're an artist, you have new work, would you think, hey, I'm going to Utrecht with my work, and there will definitely be people who will pick it up and who will understand what I'm trying to say and what I'm trying to do and think with you to even better your product. I think that's also a thing. So the city, the identity of the city needs to be changed too. If you want to be open institutes, you can be an open institute in a city, or you as a city can profile yourself to the outside world and to artists and people and visitors, of course, that this is we give place to artists with certain messages or
ideas or initiatives.
Yes.
Yeah.
Actually, I think that relates to something we've been often thinking about is the scale of our impact. So we work very, very locally, hyper local, and then you keep on asking yourself, so how many people do I actually reach? If I work so locally and so site specific, do I actually make enough difference and impact and so on? And then I heard the term called urban acupuncture. Did you guys hear
Urban
it?
acupuncture? Do anybody know what it means?
Term. I think my interpretation of it is that you a very site-specific intervention, super local, is also a very important way to generate change, even if it's not on a national, global level. So in that sense, I think the relation of our work as creatives and as institutions to a small place or to your city is really important, even if it's very local and small and only for the people of Utrecht and how many people are there and how many people do we reach, is actually a very fascinating opportunity to not only want to be bigger, constant growth, right? But to also be just happy with how do we work with each other in our own city. So that's, I think, really interesting.
So, shortly about impact and also art and stuff. Because you were talking about hip-hop in the first part. That made me think of another example. For 2 days ago, we had this event in the Bijlmer Park Theater, which is in Amsterdam Southeast, which is known as one of the most, inclusive art institutions. They do a lot with the community in the neighborhood, which is a predominantly migrant or black neighborhood. And we had this event, like a community care event for all the activists who, felt like coming together after a very intense period. And we invited a few hip-hop artists, like Akwasi, Leroy, Chief. And I found it so ironic that there's this one artist, Chief. He's young, maybe some of you have not heard about him. He has millions of followers, especially young people follow him. And he made a hip-hop track about the Zwarte Piet thing called Expose Zwarte Piet. And within a few weeks, he had almost 1 million views, which is, amazing, talking about impact. Because, we have like 3,000 followers. And we had like 5,000 views maybe. But what I found interesting that he grew up in Southeast, and it was the first time that he was in the Bijlmer Park Theater. So that made me think like, so even a space like Bijlmer Park Theater, which to us is like, one of the most inclusive places, is still not, still has this barrier for certain youth in that neighborhood.
What does that say, actually? What does that mean? What does it say to us?
Well, I think that it means that we have to constantly, critically reflect about, okay, how the Dutch word we use is drempel. Yeah? So there's a barrier for a lot of people. And maybe also that art institutions expect people to come to them, but maybe you should go and, actively go to the people themselves. So, but I'm still thinking about it.
Does that mean it's also the first time he was invited?
Probably.
Yeah. Because the other work is not necessarily, let's say, addressing political or social themes that much. So in this case it was, and it was very topical, and then he was invited to actually contribute. So it's also something to do with the nature of his work. But I understand the problem, but it's also something to do with the
atmosphere in society and the topics.
No, I guess also the chosen medium of his medium of expression. I mean, it's a scene, it's a world, and these don't always overlap.
Can I say something? I think that's a yes and a no. I can see what you mean. I mean, most tracks that he make are party tracks, so that's I think what you're referring to. But in hip hop, that shouldn't matter, and especially he's from that place. It is his neighborhood. So why is he not? And he has 1 million followers. So why is he not booked in a place that is? It's quite weird. Yeah. And I found Expose Zwarte Piet extra good example because Chief is an artist who usually make party tracks and just for fun. And I find it really strong from him that he made a track like this to bring a message to the people from I know because he probably would have thought 2 times, I know I'm going to do this and this could hurt all my radio streams and all, it could have an impact that DJs would say or whatever, we're not giving him no attention, but he still made the choice to do it, and I think that's a strong thing. And you asked me, what does language do for you? I think this is what hip hop does. I mean, this is an artist who makes his money with music, and you can have your opinion of that. But when it comes to an important subject for his culture, he made the choice and the conscious choice to say something about that with the power that he has, and that is his own music.
How do we've had a lot of, we've talked about a lot of topics right now. We talked about language as well. And also, how do we translate that into, because I don't want to use change in institutions, because we need them. We are together in this. How do we cooperate to make sure that, things get more otherwise, things get more,
And just speak to, I think there was a confusion about him being invited on stage or him never being, has he never been to the theater as an audience member? I think these are both. Yeah. Okay, so these are different questions, right? Yeah. And that's also the thing, being in the audience and being on the stage is actually the same thing. I mean, you're part of the same,
yes.
It's part of the same activity.
Is it also the same with volunteer and professional? What we just spoke about in the beginning?
I don't think so. No.
Okay. Just checking.
Okay.
I'm just thinking about it while we're talking, and a lot of people that come to the Voorkamer, they would never go to BAK.
Why?
So that's the question, right? And then
what do you think? What do you think is the reason?
I think it's a combination of different reasons. It could be just a subject of interest. Maybe they're just not interested in art, and that's one thing probably for some of them. It could be a subject of accessibility. Do they feel comfortable? Do they feel like it's a place where they can be themselves? It's a place where they can make mistakes. Mm-hmm. Or is there enough personal relation between them and that place to come? And I think that's often the work that we do in the Voorkamer. We try to create personal relationships. So we work together on a project, and then it doesn't really matter what, I mean, it could be a dinner, it could be a sculpture, it could be a performance, but in that sense you create a personal relation between a person and the place, and then he would come with his friends or with his family members, and that's why they come. They come because of that personal relation, and maybe then their interest would grow in storytelling or in art.
Are you suggesting that we kind of have to have a other kind of relation with,
I think so.
With institutions?
I think personal relationships and stories are really important in that. So we spoke about the description of the metal ring. Yeah. How do we caption art and capture them? And I think that the general description that everyone can understand is really important, but we often try to describe objects and design performances using stories. So I would make a sculpture and I would show next to it not what is the sculpture and what does it mean, but just the personal story of the person who made it. And that's for me a different way to kind of describe something, and then everyone can relate to it, and then I don't see that person anymore as a group, but I see it as Mustapha with his story. And okay. I think that's really important.
To be a little bit clear, I just want the audience, people, if you have questions, please ask. Just hold it 1 minute. Let me just hold it. The kind of relationships we're talking about. If we have a relationship with an institution, with an art institution, that means ik ben een accounthouder voor BAK. Ik ben een accounthouder voor de bibliotheek. That means I'm an account manager for the institution BAK. Is that the relationship we're talking about? Or is it another kind of form of a relationship that we will have with the institution?
What do you mean with account?
I mean, like have a pass, where we go to BAK, we have a BAK pass or something, and then you kind of become a member?
No. If that is my experience, correct me people if I'm wrong. If you ask for subsidy or you have a contact with an institution, with an organization, there is somebody in the institution that is responsible for you. So it takes care of your mail, your documentation. Is that the relationship that we're talking about here, or is it another form of a relationship?
I'll keep it short because to me that sounds very institutionalized. So I would say no. To me, I think the mission and the way an institution and its people deal with that mission is most important. To give example, when last month I'm a BAK fellow, we had our sessions, and a few days before we had this attack by fascists. So my mind was completely somewhere else and could not concentrate at all. So yeah, Whitney and Maria, they recognized the problem and they said, hey, we understand this and this and that. How can we support? So instead of, trying to keep me in the box of, these are the rules, they said, okay, how can we help? They set up a petition which is signed 3,000 times or more, maybe even more. So I think, the mission and how you deal with people that you relate to is most important, but that's my opinion.
But I just want to clear that up because sometimes it's very clear, it's good to clear things up. One question, just give me 1 minute, please. I'm sorry.
Thank you. My question in terms of this idea of rethinking relationships, I'm wondering if there, and I'm particularly interested in strategies of rethinking the relationship to people who are not only outside the institution, but who maybe are have a strong critique of the institution. And I'm curious if there's a way to bridge that. I speak as someone who's both worked for art institutions as like an employee, administrator, producer, and also as an artist. And I'm curious about that. It seems, like noticing in this room that there's like this very clear like. It seems like the idea of the institution is like we can't have a question about whether or not the institution exists really, and so I'm curious about if there's a value in having that bridge to those who maybe do bring those questions in, also being aware of the fragility of institutions and personally like I believe in the value of them, so I'm not trying to say that as a way of destroying them, but I'm curious about that.
Thank you. Do you guys understand the question? Yeah? Does anybody want to respond? Yeah?
Semi. No,
I'm thinking, and I'm not sure if it's going to be answer to your question, but I was working for a creative place somewhere here in Utrecht, and at one point I thought, I'm going to start this same place, but with total diverse program. You see, because the program was, you can buy tickets in January for January next year. So that means if we want to add diversity to this program, how are we going to do that if the agenda for the next 2 years is already decided? So if we want to bridge that gap somewhere, there's got to be an open agenda and opportunity for artists to step in. And if you have artists and institutions with the same message, how can they not cooperate? That's strange, and I hope that's a little bit. So I think that the bridge is there to for institutions and artists to find each other and strengthen the message that they want to bring to the people.
Okay, we're going to the final words. Yeah, you want to respond?
Just
quickly?
a very small, concrete tip. An example, it's definitely not a perfect institution, but the Tropenmuseum, Research Center for Material Culture, they published 2 documents. One is called Words Matter, that's about problematic language and alternatives to this problematic language. And they also published something about exactly this problem of how to deal with, criticism and difficult issues and activists, because often institutions kind of close down and get defensive. But what some of them try to do is, invite them, talk and collaborate. And they published a little document about it, something with collaboration, and they talk about radical listening and things like that. So it's free online, you can find it online and educate yourself about it.
Okay, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We are out of time. Thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you. I think we have lunch now. Thank you very much for all your comments and questions.
Thank you so very much. Thank you, everyone. This is quite a marathon, no? We're going to continue. I just wanna say it once again that if you need to recharge your cups or anything, feel free to move in and out of the room. Although, of course, I want to encourage you to stay with us till the very end. Isshaq. Laura. We have Laura Raicovich now, who's going to speak about the Manifestations of Neutrality. Laura is an extremely fascinating thinker, writer, organizer, great friend who's been extremely helpful also in thinking through the trainings for the Not Yet. The floor is yours. Thank you so very much, Laura.
Yeah, I think it's good. Can you hear me? Okay, good. Hi. How you doing? Yeah? All right. So, thank you, Maria. Thank you, BAK. Thank you, Jeanne, really, for inviting me into this project. It's been a really beautiful experience to be part of together. And I feel really fortunate to have shared it. And I'm going to just jump right in. So I've worked at many different arts organizations, from Dia Art Foundation, that's Dia Beacon, and the Guggenheim, to Creative Time. This is a project by Duke Riley where pigeons wore little lights and he trained them to fly in amazing patterns. And also the Queen's Museum. And in fact, I was the director of the Queen's Museum for 3 years, and I left nearly 2 years ago now because of differences I had with a small group of board members. These differences were heightened and highlighted by the election of Donald Trump. And what they had in common was a problematic relationship to what can be called the neutral. Following my departure from the museum, I started thinking a lot about what the concept of neutrality means in relationship to our lives today, and how the myth of the neutral position remains within museums and cultural institutions in the past as well as the present. I began to interview people to understand how neutrality operates in the world and to read about the history of museums, particularly in the United States. But I think a lot of these readings, just to narrow the field, but I think a lot of these readings have a much bigger impact as well, or relevance. So when I'm discussing my research on this persistent myth of neutrality, I often get a really inquisitive look followed by, do you really think people think that a space can be neutral in 2019? Especially with people in other fields other than art. And I think while these other fields have wrestled with neutrality, the cultural sphere has really yet to take it on, leaving a looming blind spot within institutions that comprises unstated biases that perpetuate exclusion and alienation. And this, I think, is part of what we were beginning to talk about in talking about the barriers from the last panel. What are those barriers? Some of them are related to this. So making visible and addressing these biases would actually enable a much expanded public engagement within museums, and I think would cultivate an active cultural commons to support civic life, which is a role I believe very strongly that museums should undertake. So how does this myth of neutrality operate? What follows is a recent example that lays out the challenges. And this is what Mitchell was talking about. With a membership of over 40,000 people around the world, the International Council of Museums, otherwise known as ICOM, bears a considerable weight in its areas of expertise. Founded in 1946, for nearly 75 years, the organization has defined the museum as a nonprofit institution that acquires, conserves, researches, communicates, and exhibits the tangible and intangible heritage of humanity and its environment for the purposes of education, study, and enjoyment. Recently, ICOM, well, some members of ICOM revisited this definition
because they felt it was out of date. New wording was proposed that describes museums as being democratizing, inclusive, and polyphonic spaces for critical dialogue about the pasts and the futures that safeguard memories for future generations and guarantee equal rights and equal access to heritage for all people. The proposed language goes on to say that museums aim to contribute to human dignity and social justice, global equality, and planetary well-being. Then, this came out in mid-August, and then a backlash against the proposed definition hit a high point, with over 24 of ICOM's national branches, including France, Italy, Spain, and Russia, calling this proposed definition ideological. The objections focus on this perceived ideology of the new proposal implies that the proper definition or the previous definition was actually by nature non-ideological, and that it in fact proceeds from a neutral place. The question of whether museums are neutral is at the crux of a contemporary conundrum about stories, how stories have been told, who has told them, why and how they have been framed and historicized, and what it means that foundational stories are being challenged today by a diversity of long marginalized perspectives. Since museums are a mode of preserving and presenting history, we must ask, has the museum ever really been a neutral space? Has it not always had an agenda in its foundation? Can it be wrong if those agendas include human dignity and planetary well-being, which are clearly positive aims? There exists a widespread discomfort around these ideas, as well as the fear that cultural institutions and museums will be diminished by making visible their founding biases. It's my contention that these explicit and implicit biases exist throughout our human culture, but that we must, at a minimum, make them visible and confront the intended and unintended consequences of this very human condition. So while the proposed new ICOM definition might be flawed, the response to its particular wording sheds light on the fact that for many, neutrality in a museum context is seen as the location of expertise and is not viewed as freighted with ideology in spite of its ongoing function as a veil for gatekeeping and exclusion. These persistent attitudes are further of interest because according to the American Alliance of Museums, museums are not only one of the most popular leisure activities in the United States, surprisingly beating out major league sporting events and theme parks combined in attendance, but they are also some of the most trusted sources of information. Simultaneously, it seems that each week there are new calls from very different quarters to make museums more accessible, more relevant, more affordable. The list goes on. Plus, there was a Museum Next survey that recently reported that among people under 30 years of age, 44% believe that a museum that took on social issues would be more relevant to them. So what gives? So given my knowledge as a former insider and a current outsider to museums and cultural institutions, as well as given what I saw unfold at the Queen's Museum in 2016, 2017, and 2018, and my current research, I have quite a lot to say on this topic. I thought I'd share some observations about neutrality with you in the hope that you'd have some questions and ideas of your own to share. So I'm going to start with some slides and some ideas, and we'll take it from there. I believe that in museums and cultural spaces, we have to question this idea of the neutral because it centers the dominant culture upon which the structure of the museum is based and excludes stories and histories on the margins. Further, in this particular moment in history, wherein inequity, nationalisms, and the reality of potential human extinction are on the rise, in a vastly depleted civic sphere, can we begin to imagine another way of being and doing that might be better for more of us? Could we perhaps practice these ways of being and doing so that when we arrive at the moment, when they are the new normal, that we know how to behave? Could the spaces we do this practicing be within museums and cultural organizations, given that they are supposedly, in fact, containers for culture? Can we think collectively about what the not yet might yet want to be, and what we want our culture, our collective culture, to look like? I have so many questions. So just keep some of these in mind as I talk through the slides. I'll also I'm going to introduce you to some friends and colleagues, as well as some dead people who thought some interesting things, and we'll see how this might be useful. So as I was formulating a working web of definitions around neutrality, writer and poet Wayne Koestenbaum, that's him, and I had lunch at a place on 8th Avenue. We ate cacio e pepe, which is a lovely pasta dish. And he recommended that I read Roland Barthes' annotated lectures delivered as a course at the Collège de France from 1977 to 78 on the neutral. Of course, loving Wayne, I immediately got a copy. So Wayne, via Bart, that's Bart, challenges me to think of the neutral as another type of space, one that has infinite flexibility and dimension, where meaning remains flexible and full of possibility. So he talks about sleep and silence and tact as examples of stances that embody this neutrality because they are full of potential. This vein of thinking runs in direct contradiction to my own feelings that the neutral condition is quite literally impossible to achieve. I struggled through the chapters on Bart until Bart describes a shopping spree he makes for colored inks. He writes, I go out to buy some paints, Sennelier inks, bottles of pigment, following my taste for the names golden yellow, sky blue, brilliant green, purple, yellow sun, Cartham pink, a rather intense pink. I buy 16 bottles. In putting them away, I knock one over. In sponging up, I make a new little mess, little domestic complications. And now I'm going to give you the official name of the spilled color, a name printed on the small bottle. It's the color called neutral. Well, I was both punished and disappointed because neutral spatters and stains. It is a type of dull gray black. Sorry, I only found blue spilled ink on the web. And I was disappointed because neutral is a color like the others and for sale, and therefore neutral is not unmarketable. The unclassifiable is classified. All the more reason for us to go back to the discourse, which at least cannot say what neutral is. So, I disagree with Bart because I think we can say what neutral is. Even in his attempt to keep the neutral empty and full of potential, it becomes a color, an ink that can be spilled, that can make a mess. It seems the neutral isn't nothing. It is something, after all. Bart insists on it as a space of possibility, an idea I really wish I could accept and believe was true in the context of the museum or frankly anywhere else, but history and daily experience gets in my way. So later in the same chapter, another moment, this time the neutral stands in for the not yet. The not yet is another space of possibility and imagination in which I am particularly interested, thanks to Jeanne. Bart wants neutrality to be a space before meaning, anticipating meaning, and perhaps even prefiguring other realities. He writes, this integrally and almost exhaustively nuanced space is the shimmer. The neutral is the shimmer. That whose aspect, perhaps whose meaning, is subtly modified according to the angle of the subject's gaze. So, what is the subject, the angle of the subject's gaze? I think this is our positionality, the ways in which we approach the world, the ways in which meaning is inflected by our own histories and traumas and experience and identities. No matter how pre-meaning one wants to get, these elements of ourselves aren't dissolvable, they don't disappear. They're not immaterial, they're not vacant. Even as babies, we have our ancestors' experiences embedded in our own DNA. So we come to Christina Sharp. This is Christina. She wrote a really brilliant book called In the Wake, which I think everybody should read because it's amazing. And here she elegantly weaves her critical theories with the ways in which chattel slavery and the realities of forced migrations across the Middle Passage are epigenetically passed to descendants whose bodies and minds entwine with their genes on the daily. She writes, in the wake, the past, the past that is not past reappears, always to rupture the present. The past, or more accurately, pastness, is a position. Thus, in no way can we identify the past as past. In other words, the past is always with us in the present. This isn't good or bad, it just is, and it demands our recognition. It means something, and it makes it harder to imagine something before meaning. She goes on to say the following of descendants of the formerly enslaved Black Americans. Despite knowing otherwise, we are often disciplined into thinking through and along lines that reinscribe our own annihilation, reinforcing and reproducing what Sylvia Wynter has called our narratively condemned status. We must become undisciplined. The work we do requires new modes and methods of research and teaching, new ways of entering and leaving the archives of slavery. I have been thinking of this gathering, this collecting, and this reading towards a new analytic as the wake and wake work. I am interested in how we imagine ways of knowing that past in excess of the fictions of the archive. But not only that, I'm interested too in the ways we recognize the many manifestations of that fiction and that excess, that past not yet past in the present. So maybe understanding how the past is not yet past can help us imagine the future we desire in the not yet. So the artist Jeanne van Heeswijk, she thinks extremely and particularly compellingly about, in her language, the space of the not yet. For her, and for me too, the not yet is a collectively imagined potential space. Jeanne and I have discussed this at length, and she talks about training for the not yet, or practicing the not yet. What does it look like? I think we can see some of that here today. It's something perhaps we can imagine doing together, or maybe we're already practicing doing it together, and training and exercising those muscles that perhaps are weak and underdeveloped. We need to go to the gym more. And this space actually really requires our subjectivity, our individual desires, ourselves, and that we put those things at risk. We do not abandon our individuality, but create a space to enact it with one another in the shared task of finding meaning, or even losing what we might think is important in order to sit in this space of togetherness. Is it worth it to take these risks together to locate collective meanings? Can we co-create a space that is generous enough for non-homogeneous, even rhizomatic or fractured activities and personae? Making space, in fact, for the emergence of conflict, being uncomfortable together, to actually be in the wake together, to acknowledge the violence of the past and the present, and what this necessitates of the future? Can we learn to listen deeply enough that we can hear what others might need and adapt accordingly? Can we withhold our desire to share ideas and ideals long enough to allow others entry? Or, in Jeanne's words, to understand what might emerge from the fact that all these differences are there together? And it likely means sitting in this space of openness and non-resolution for longer than we're accustomed. We must hold off on declaring victory. We have to avoid pronouncing success. And this is so hard for us to do. We're trained otherwise. It goes against so many of our ingrained instincts, but to access this space of the not yet, we must not foreclose its possibility. So we postpone and we atomize and we confront one another and vacillate and change our minds. and hold firm in the ambiguity. In this struggle, can we hope to be the spilled inks that might mingle together? Could this finally be a space of potential? So every day we negotiate with ourselves to navigate the world in all its joy and pain and boredoms. Maybe we let ourselves be misunderstood and become more comfortable with unresolved communications. After all, we likely fail to communicate through language, voice, and gesture, and touch much more often than we succeed. So what does this mean for the neutral? Could it be imagined as Barth's space of possibility, as a place that can hold these meanings, rather than evoking the values and ideals of one particular group or position? I do not think so. I'm particularly thinking of the artist Chloe Bass, whose work is also in the exhibition, and her assessment of her own positionality in relationship to institutions. She says, "I'm an observer. This is not a neutral position by any stretch. Again, there is no neutral position, but my hope is that I can look towards most intimate situations as a way of formulating frameworks for thinking through a thing, rather than quickly forming positions about them. My activism is getting people to see, understand, communicate, and remember, all in the service of how we can live better together. The most important aspect of my position is to remain accountable to the ways in which my own current vision, past experience, and future hopes work in the service of what I preach, and to start a difficult reconciliation and evaluation process with myself if or when they don't." If this is my fantasy, how does it operate within museums and cultural institutions? In the case of museums in the United States, whose foundational aesthetics, collections, and funds come from the white, older men that are at the core of so many cultural institutions, there are layers and histories that need to be added to the mix. So, to help to get to the bottom of the neutral, I wanted to think more broadly. What does it mean with respect to journalism, for example? In the age of fake news and Trumpism, maybe there's a way of understanding our realities. And here, oh, I forgot to show you Chloe. That's Chloe. Sorry, Chloe. Rebecca. And here I look to Rebecca Solnit, who has written, "We tend to treat people on the fringe as ideologues and those in the center as neutral, as though the decision were not our own." As though the decision not to own a car is a political one and the decision to own one is not. As though to support a war is neutral and to oppose it is not. Further, when I spoke to her specifically about this project, she said, "My best journalism professor was Ben Bagdikian, ombudsman for the Washington Post during the Watergate and the Pentagon Papers. He had this wonderful line, 'You can't be objective, but you can try to be fair.' That came just before my immersion in postmodernism, in which there is no neutral position. Bagdikian's approach had a huge influence on me, because in journalism, you do pretend to be neutral, like God. And we're not God, and God isn't neutral either, and neither are the goddesses. Fairness and accuracy and honesty are about disclosing where you stand rather than pretending that you don't have a horse in the race." And then this is a good one, but that's what I just read, so I'm going to move on. And from Robert Jensen in his essay, The Myth of the Neutral Professional, "There are issues that can occur if the notion of neutrality in memory institutions does not continually get challenged. For instance, if a memory institution is perceived as being neutral, then actions like adding First Nations stories of oppression to the collection to rectify past imbalances of perspectives can be framed as not an action of balance, but rather a political act. This could lead memory institutions to avoid necessary actions because they are risky, and they do not want to be political. These two statements are central to the problematics of assuming neutrality." We've all seen these labeled neutral palettes within the museum. Not with these within the museum, but you know what I'm talking about. If as a culture we are steeped in the dominant narrative of history, of art, of life, it becomes a political act to add or to shine a light upon the non-dominant. So in a society of white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, in institutions of white Western primacy, actively decolonialist pro-Black, pro-Latinx, pro-Indigenous, pro-family by all definitions, pro-refugee, self-reflective feminist positions are all, by default, regarded as political. They are perceived as aggressive, in defiance of, alternative to, a challenge to the status quo, rather than being facets of reality that are equal to the dominant story. Even recognizing the presence of an alternative to the dominant becomes an adversarial act, a challenge for that very dominance. And yet these stories, these many multiple stories, are a much bigger part of history, the part that's left out, like this guy, that guy. He doesn't have his arm up, I noticed. And this is why the non-neutral is the territory we must strive for within cultural institutions, because if these organizations contain or display or collect somehow our culture, they are missing enormous swaths of it, and they are not, and therefore they are not, radically inclusive. They fail at some of their most desired and lofty goals of helping us struggle with who and what we are to ourselves and one another. So let's look at neutrality from just another perspective, that of international relations. So this is my friend Karen Quoney. She is the curator and director of the Vera List Center for Art and Politics. She's also Swiss. And she recently told me a story about a friend of hers who's a diplomat and works in the field in Switzerland. And he talked to her about the ways in which diplomats sometimes create neutral spaces in order to bring two parties together. Take as an example two nations in conflict about trade negotiations or a border issue. Sometimes bringing them to Geneva, to a room in a third space that is completely anonymous, actually helps them achieve a checklist of sorts towards agreed upon resolutions. Even if they're non-binding, even if they're never adopted or even voted upon in their home nations, these resolutions exist as a type of goal or something aspirational for the end of the conflict. And it could form a useful function as a possible future. This is interesting to me in part because it shifts the idea of the neutral from a pre-existing condition to one of future possibility. In this case, both parties in the conflict had to believe to some extent that the space being created in Geneva was or could be neutral, or at least indifferent to their particular conflict. It might not have mattered that in spite of its rhetoric, Switzerland's neutrality, particularly in European conflicts, has historically often resulted in the endurance of the status quo and in intense violence. As long as this specific space at a particular moment in time could be neutral to the parties in conflict, it might work. But this takes a lot of imagination. So while we think about that, I'm going to give you another example. This is Ram Manikalingam, and he is the director of the Dialogue Advisory Group, or DAG, which he founded after working at the United Nations. While he was at the UN, he became frustrated because while the UN is certainly a forum for some forms of international conflict, Ram felt that in situations concerning violence in particular, particularly in situations of significant power imbalances between the factions, the UN just couldn't go far enough. They had rules that prevented them from doing so. Their position in attempting an unbiased position in co-presenting hundreds of nations just didn't allow the necessary flexibility. And so he wrote to me recently, DAG tries to ask how we get to a decent solution and whether our initial efforts to contribute to such a solution or not. So we have a practical humanitarian ethic where we say that generally reducing violence helps the weaker side and of course also helps ordinary people who are more likely to suffer from it than the wealthy. We do not take a moral stance on violence. We are not pacifists and understand that actors will resort to violence to achieve their goals, but they could come to us when they get stuck in their violent political project and look for a way to get out of it. We also make a distinction between judging and understanding. So unlike human rights activists whose job it is to judge a situation and condemn the bad guys, our job is to understand motivations and use them to push people towards better behavior. We're quite comfortable working more with one side than the other. And that doesn't imply our affinity for a particular side, but simply our understanding of where we would have the most impact. And we are quite comfortable with being tainted with a particular side. For example, in Spain, we were attacked by the right wing for being too close to ETA, the Basque separatist group. And in a way, we were, because our job was to build trust with them in order to disarm them. In Libya, we were being attacked for being too close to the Islamist armed groups in Tripoli. And we were, because they were the groups no one was engaging with. But it doesn't necessarily come from any feeling that those groups are the underdogs or that justice is on their side. It's simply a practical matter. They have power and need to be involved in any sustainable solution. Manika Lingam brings up the ways in which unequal power relationships create circumstances that demand non-neutrality. And so it's fascinating to me that this is the guiding principle to their engagement with a crisis or a violent situation. They are building trust and engagement with the less powerful side in order to make dialogue even possible. It isn't about equal footing, but rather the necessary groundwork to even attempt communication. It's simply a practical matter. They have power and need to be involved in any sustainable solution. And so the myth of the neutral and the not yet. It seems to me that if we make a space of possibility for the world we would like to live in and practice together what our collective and individual desires for the not yet are, we may make it real someday. But none of it is possible unless we acknowledge the meaning and the content of the so-called neutral position. Identity and experience is too old for there to be a neutral space like the one that Barth describes. You have to go back to the Big Bang, the hot, thin soup, to find this version of neutral space, and even then, I'm not so sure. So we look to the future, to the not yet, and maybe we find the spaces we desire, the ones where we are each seen and heard, and the ones in which we are most generous to one another. And these spaces might look different all the time, and they might be spaces of silence or conflict or joy. They might hold awkwardness and fear, and simultaneously be sites where we can celebrate not knowing together, perhaps where care can simply be being together. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Shall we sit? We sit. Yes.
You can stand if you want.
So I'm going to try to work through some of the being behind. So I'm going to squeeze time a bit. You know, until we discussed the notion of neutrality, I was really unaware such a position is possible. So it's something that's just something completely new. But I was reminded by a story, and that relates to concerned artists of the Philippines, who we hosted in Utrecht 2014, 2015, I don't quite remember. And I brought my art history students to meet them. And Lisa Ito, who's an excellent thinker and curator and a writer, was giving a presentation which appeared too propaganda-like to my students. And yeah, rightly so. They dubbed it communist, but essentially it was an idea of social realism, not socialist realism, but social realism, that where they would see the role of art in education, emancipation, and empowerment. And so they finished their wonderful lecture, and my students are completely silent. And then I try to kind of pull out of them what is going on, and they go like, this is just silly propaganda. And they pick this up as an opportunity, not as an insult, but as an opportunity, and just start to ask them, what is it that you're doing? So they show what they're doing. And somehow through the dialogue, Lisa shows them that their work is propaganda too. It's something that functions within the realm of ideology of neoliberal capitalism, ending up with a sentence, both you and us are in the realm of ideological propaganda. The difference between you and I is that I'm aware of it. And I think this is a very important tale when it comes to neoliberal capitalism, because it does sell itself as neutral. Yeah,
and just to give an example that maybe solidifies the position further inside the walls of the museum. You know, there are plenty of times, for example, that curators and museum directors will commission an artwork from an artist that has a particular political or social content that then a funder or a board member is like, whoa, what the heck, you know? And I have heard and seen people say to that person, well, of course, we don't take a side on that particular issue, but it's the right of the artist's freedom of expression to decide how they want to say that. And this is like a completely disingenuous statement because, of course, why would you pick it if you thought it was, you know, unless you thought it was the right thing to do? And so, you know, I actually think that that conversation is the responsibility for the institution to engage with, to actually say, well, these are the reasons we did this project, and to be frank about that and not to kind of hide behind free speech issues and artistic production, because that's super disingenuous and also part of this neoliberal construct, you know?
Other questions? Yes. Is there somebody help me to with this? I'm happy to lend this one.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your talk. And before my question, I just want to say that I acknowledge that I'm a native English speaker from the United States, and there have been a lot of our voices in the room, and that tends to happen. And I think it also has to do with the way our educational system, the way we're primed to do that, but I'm acutely aware of that as I speak. The question actually stems even from the last session, but very connected to what you talked about. And I think it has to do with transparency. I'm kind of trying to work through it as I was thinking about this thing that most recently came up in the Netherlands. Mitchell was talking about Gouden Eeuw, which is the golden age, and how this is problematic. And thinking through, like, do we just remove those words then? Or do we somehow add something to language to point out that it's problematic, but so that the way we talk about that time is still inclusive? I mean, it's important to, you refer to it as balance. It's important to, to me it has parallels to how many institutions now are decommissioning certain artworks or even selling off certain artworks in order to purchase or make space for other kinds of voices, other histories that had not been present. But then do we somehow, or do you know of any institutions that actually demonstrate that absence? Like, could you leave like a, you know, that maybe it's that Bart's Gray kind of a square on the wall where that artwork used to be, as opposed to just, it's not there anymore and another one's there because we're priming the society to be together differently.
I think what you're asking is a really important question, which is, do we erase the evidence of our past problematic positions? And I don't think, I mean, on a certain level, I have no fear that they will be so well erased that we'll ever forget about them. Because it's also embedded in people's bodies and the bodies that are missing from certain spaces forever because of what happened in the past. I think that there are certainly tactics that are underway currently, like, for example, at the American Museum of Natural History, where there are these extremely problematic dioramas of First Nations peoples and the way that used sacred objects are displayed. You know, these are the results of colonial genocide, and those are the stories that get repeated through the narratives of the visual narratives of just how they're installed. Now, that institution has taken on a process. They've made a dedication to going through a process. I'm not sure they would call it decolonization exactly, but of kind of making right some of those problematic things. And so, you know, while whole dioramas haven't changed yet, there are labels to talk about what the problems are. And I still see that as a halfway measure, because we need to be telling, yes, it's not about erasing the fact that that there was a genocidal colonial project happening in the colonial United States, but to actually address it, you know. and perhaps not to use sacred objects as the markers of that storytelling. So, you know, I'll give another example that I think relates very closely to the Golden Age issue, because, you know, the Golden Age obviously was a period of enormous trauma for certain colonized peoples. And that is when I was recently in Australia, and I'd never been to Australia before, and sometimes when you enter into like a totally different cultural space, you see things that you might not otherwise. And I walked into the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and, you know, it was like this breath of fresh air, because there was no exchange anything at the front door. I was like, oh, you can just walk in, it's kind of nice. No, you know, ticket or sticker or anything. And on my right, the first gallery that I came upon was a gallery that said 19th century Australian art. And I walked in, and there were some like really beautiful paintings and sculptures, all European, white European produced. 2 or 3 women were represented in that group. And we kept looking around, and I was like, well, surely there were other people in Australia making work in the 19th century, making art in the 19th century, other than these white Europeans. And, you know, that became stunningly obvious to me just having walked into that space for the first time. And they had an amazing sculpture by actually a man from Papua New Guinea in the center of the space of Captain Cook, who is like their Columbus figure, who discovered the continent. And you know, the sculpture was made, it was larger than life and made in a kind of highly reflective metal, and so it kind of sucked in all of the works around it. But to me, that wasn't even adequate, because it was just one work in the space of 3 major galleries full of work. And the galleries dedicated to Aboriginal and Torres Strait people's art was 2 levels down in the basement.
How bad would that be if I stop the conversation here? Is it... How many people are having burning questions here in the room?
I just wonder if a little bit on the idea of, like, I guess, disabusing of the myth of neutrality, and think more about, like, neutrality is a concept that we know exists and people use, so why not be more just thinking about how undesirable it is, or being against neutrality and against its usages, and sort of breaking down the fact that it's something that is used and it's a problem, and you know, and sort of what is the opposite of that?
Hold on, don't forget, please. Thank you. I had the reverse version of this question. How do you today, as an art institution, declare your non-neutrality? What are the modes of declaration? Of course, you do certain things through practice, but then you go and applying for funds, and you don't begin like, I'm the Marxist art organization that wants to change the world, and like, I'm exaggerating. But so, what is the mode of declaration of that other side of the coin?
So I guess I think we have to be clear about what our intentions and values are. And so, for example, one of the things that we did at the Queen's Museum following the election of Donald Trump, because I knew that certain of our decisions to protect or to try to support and to try to protect some of our staff members from the xenophobic policies that were arising, was to actually just say publicly what we cared about and believed in. And so that for me was like a very simple way of doing it. And through that, it was very clear that we were not taking a neutral position. But I like this example that, like, Rebecca Solnit says, that like when you're anti-war, it's a position, but not saying anything isn't.
But the idea was the car that fascinates me, because there it becomes much clearer.
Right.
To have a car is just normal. If you don't have one, you're a lunatic.
Yeah, or whatever. Yeah, or whatever. Or you're not wealthy enough to have a car. Like, it becomes something. It's something else. It's not position, and it is a position, actually. So I'm sorry, Maria, say it again. What were you? Oh, how do you declare it? So yes, through, I think through actually actively stating it. But I think actually even more important than that is operationalizing the values you espouse. Because I think part of what happens with bigger institutions is that they have these like gorgeous mission statements, which when you actually look at the way big, small institutions, whatever, institutions have these gorgeous mission statements that present like the most beautiful aspirational language, but then when you look inside at even how they're functioning, what their structures look like, what their relationships between their staff is, it breaks down completely. And, you know, so I think operationalizing whatever those espoused values are is core to that. And that requires a revolution internally. That requires really.
Yeah, I agree and disagree with you. Agree and disagree. I mean, yeah, declaring is sometimes possible. I mean, it ended up, you know, in a particular way in your particular case somehow.
Yeah, definitely.
So
I mean,
then
you have to be willing to take risks also.
Indeed. So you're no longer shaping. That's a hugely important museum that you shape to, you know, wow, to height and depth. That you know, that was incredible.
Well, I think to your point, I think you can also do it undercover. And sometimes I think what happens, what's really great is if we can work with artists, because art oftentimes is not suspected, because it's like kind of considered this bourgeois thing to like not suspected of trouble. You know, for example, when I was working with Trevor Paglin on a project where he wanted to take a helicopter and fly to photograph the NSA and the CIA and these like national security buildings, you know, I just said to the editor, I was like, look, don't worry about it. Just call the CIA's press office and just be like, hey, we're this arts institution in New York and we want to take a picture of your building. Is that okay? And they were like, yeah, fine, cool, whatever. They did not give a shit. And so we were able to take these photographs that then became public use. And then when the Edward Snowden piece came out, or this was after the Edward Snowden piece came out, but subsequent to that, there wasn't just this old grotty image from 1972 that made it feel like the NSA was not in the present. We were able to provide an image of the NSA and all of these other spy agencies and their budgets to make the public aware of their existence in a way. So yeah, you know, you can use it for cover.
So this is what I wanted to, I mean, it really depends on the situation and on the particular political conditions within which you labor. And articulation as to what is your priority. Sometimes it's much more important to maintain the, you know, safety, possibility of functioning of an art institution, and then you use other tactics that open declaration. Loopholing, hacking, hijacking, whatever depends on the particular situation, on the particular goal.
Yeah, and I would say, you know, those were my strategies up until the point at which I felt there was an ethical problem that I could not, you know, logic my way through. And then I recognized that actually my resignation would be more powerful an expression than staying and continuing that labor. And what's been interesting over the last almost 2 years is that my platform and my voice has only gotten louder in the public context than it would have been if I had been able to stay at the museum, which was something that I certainly desired, but I couldn't. I just couldn't.
Yeah. There are so many issues to discuss. For example, Queen's Museum under your directorship was a member of ICOM, but that we will have over dinner. Yeah, as a conversation. Thank you so very much, Laura. Thank you, thank you. Just check in here. Do you hydrate well? Do you have enough coffee or tea or whatever you need to take? We have one more relay before dinner, and we're going to postpone dinner by anyway. Come back, please. Don't go forever. Come back.